World of Warcraft has a very long list of expansions already. It's a game that is over 20 years old by now, and it's no surprise that Blizzard has made a lot of expansions. They invented a lot of expansions, but still, sometimes it feels like they just rush through their ideas, through some very big ideas that each could have really stood on its own as its own expansion. And lately, my thoughts came to that because of how the War Within ends, and it gives us Karesh as the final patch of the expansion. Which is a whole world. It could have easily held a whole expansion by itself, as we have done with one of my friends who is running like his small portion of my tabletop game, who's handling Karesh as like his part of the game world. And Karesh really has the potential, being a whole world, it really has the potential to hold up a whole expansion. And because my thoughts were with that, because of that, when I look back at the history of World of Warcraft, I see that there are a lot of very big ideas, very big concepts that could have held up on its own, just like Karesh. These big concepts that have been just rushed through in like patches or single zones that we never really got to see properly, because Blizzard seems to just rush through their major ideas and then try to come up with new ideas to fill up the slots that they've emptied. So I just thought I would look back at a little bit at the history of World of Warcraft and see what else they kind of wasted on like small patches, things that could have really been their own expansions. Early on in the game, there isn't really so much of that. Well, vanilla World of Warcraft did a lot of things. It did a lot of things in patches, but then we actually got expansions often tied to those ideas from those patches. Like we had in vanilla, we had patches about the Scourge and the Old Gods, and I will not argue that those ideas have been wasted on those patches, because they have later been expanded with the expansions to the game. That's what expansions do. They expand things. So I'll not argue about anything specific about the vanilla World of Warcraft. And even in the first early expansions, these first expansions are really about their own thing, and they really focus on really exploring that idea. When we come to Outland in the Burning Crusade, the whole expansion is really about Outland. The patches that are added in TBC, they really expand on the ideas of Outland, or expand on the other things that were introduced with the expansion, like the Blood Elves, which have a major role in Outland, and their home of Silvermoon and Eversong Woods. It's expanded with the Isle of Quel'Danas in the later patch, and though it's no longer an Outland and it heads out, but it heads back to Azeroth, to the ideas and themes that were important to the expansion, and really it ties everything back together. And the patch zone, the last patch zone in the Burning Crusade is just Isle of Quel'Danas. I don't think you can make a whole expansion out of just Isle of Quel'Danas. They are going to make an expansion that is focused around Quel'Thalas as a whole. They are making that expansion as the next one, and the reveal is coming like July, August. Very soon that reveal of that whole Midnight expansion is coming, and we will see just how much they do with each zone, how much they expand the world there. So you can make an expansion out of Quel'Thalas, but you can't really make an expansion out of Quel'Danas just. So I will not argue that Quel'Danas wasted an expansion's worth of ideas. Same is true about Wrath of the Lich King, which doesn't really veer away from Northrend much. Don't get me wrong, Wrath of the Lich King really wasted some ideas too. Azul Nerub was supposed to originally be a zone, but for technical reasons they couldn't make it a zone. So instead, they just did like 2 dungeons, and that still, wasted the idea of Azul Nerub. But there wasn't really like expansions worth of ideas that were crammed into a patch or into like half a patch in Wrath of the Lich King. So unless I'm forgetting something, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that Wrath really went very far out anywhere beyond just Northrend and expanding more up on the Northrend. But then we start getting to those expansions that really start to cram a lot of different ideas together. And the very next expansion after Wrath was the expansion that this is the first of a series of expansions that in its time has been labeled as the worst expansion ever. And of course, in time there will come a new worst expansion ever. And I'm sure eventually we'll find another worst expansion ever very soon. If it's not Midnight, then maybe the Last Titan will be dubbed as the worst expansion. Because, they always come eventually, every few years. But Cataclysm wasn't the worst expansion ever, really, if you ask me. But Cataclysm did start ramming many ideas together. The core idea of what led to them developing Cataclysm was just the idea of remaking the old world and updating it to the current lore, to the current events. And because that updating took up so much of their time and effort, they couldn't really do a lot with the other things they wanted to do in the game. And one of the things that feels almost like tacked onto Cataclysm was the elemental plane. Because if you really look at the lore of the elemental plane, it's a whole plane. It's not as big as a universe. It's certainly as big as a planet. And if you look at the lore of the elemental plane, perhaps I should do like how I fixed elemental plane in World of WarCraft video, because it's a huge idea. The elemental plane is supposed to be this like bounded smaller plane that the Titans created to imprison Azeroth's elementals for serving the old gods. And often there was this idea, used to be this idea among the community, that the elemental plane was like a hollow earth type of situation, because of one way to interpret the description in the RPG books that describe the elemental plane. But there is another way of interpreting it, in that this plane looks more like a flat earth than a hollow earth. In that Deepholm is the world, the flat surface of the world. Underneath that surface lies the Firelands. Over that surface you have the sky wall, being the earth part of the plane, and you also have the oceans of the abyssal maw crisscrossing that main earthly plane of the plane. I don't know how else to word that, to not repeat the wording, but you know what I mean. And whether it is a hollow world or whether it is a flat world that is encased in its own plane of existence, it's a whole world's worth of ideas. And what we see out of it in Cataclysm is one zone on release, that is Deepholm, and one zone in a patch, and that is Firelands, which is like mostly like a small questing zone, the Molten Front, and the Raid. And Firelands really can stand on its own as a zone or a major part of the patch by just giving you a lot of different cultures of these elementals. I don't speak a lot about it on the channel, at least not yet, but I love expanding on the culture of the elementals and how they differ. In one of my campaigns, one of my games I had in the World of Warcraft, we had a whole campaign that was focused on the Firelands, and we saw a lot more than just the Molten Front and the raid area. We saw a sea of lava, and on that sea of lava lay the city of brass, which, yes, I borrowed that from D&D. But we had the city of brass, and the city of brass, we had the Efreets. And in my version, the Efreets came from the same Titanic template as the Draenei or Ogres or Mogu. They came from the same Titanic template, only by being left in the Firelands. They were like corrupted, quote unquote corrupted. They were changed into elemental creatures, and they became Efreets. And I made it so that you actually see Efreets in World of Warcraft in a way, because remember those fire dancers from that one like toy that look like Draenei but like made of fire, and they're never really explained in the canon lore. So I made those to be Efreets, because, they look kind of like Draenei, they look kind of like the genes or the Efreets of the actual real world myths. They look kind of like Draenei, but they're made of fire, so I merged those ideas together to make them like a whole race. And that is just one plane, one part of the elemental plane that you can really expand. You can do a lot with Skywall, with the actual Djinns of Skywall. You can do a lot more with the Abyssal Maw that was completely cancelled from the Cataclysm. It was supposed to be a raid in Cataclysm, but they couldn't figure out something with the maybe it was because people hated Bashir so much, so they cancelled the underwater Abyssal Maw raid. So Abyssal Maw got completely cancelled. Skywall became just a raid. There's a lot of culture and a lot of really these alien cultures that you could get into that could really expand. And I really should just go with that. Have I fixed the elemental plane in World of Warcraft VU at this point? But it is a whole second expansion just crammed into that Deathwing expansion. And that was the first time that really happened. The second time that I feel like we got a second expansion crammed on top of the existing one was Pandaria. And I know it was unpopular in its time, because people saw talking pandas, and they were like, "Oh, it's for children. Oh, it's for the Chinese players." Just don't be stupid. Don't say things like that. There's nothing inherently childish about having panda bear people in a game. I am not Chinese, and I greatly enjoyed Mists of Pandaria. And I enjoyed when the plot was actually about Pandaria. But then halfway through the expansion, Garrosh just takes over. And I don't mind. I actually like the plots when the external elements come onto the new setting, and they start to mess with that setting. They start to change things, and you have to deal with that external element, or this new world has to manage these new elements, because it's an inevitable part of life and existence that you have to deal with these new elements coming in, and you have to manage adapting those new elements and live with them. And in Mists of Pandaria, when the Alliance and the Horde make their landfall, and I like the idea that that the Pandaren have to deal with these new forces arriving, and they have to deal with rejoining the greater world. I like those ideas, but then Garrosh just completely takes over the plot, and the final patch just pretty much almost completely abandons Pandaria and is all about Garrosh, and the raid is in Orgrimmar. I really wish that Mists of Pandaria in the end was all about Pandaria. Also about how Pandaria deals with these external elements. But also, I would have made the Thunder King the final boss of Mists of Pandaria, because he is the final boss of Pandaria. He's the big bad of Pandaria, and he should have been the final boss of the expansion. Maybe I would have made Garrosh the mid expansion raid, and then he's captured in the mid patch and he's sent off, and then he breaks out after the expansion. And don't get me started on how the WoW never represented the Garrosh's trial and escape, like we've never seen that in the game. Don't get me started on that. Or maybe I would have made just Garrosh do his whole spiel after Pandaria and make like a whole mix the ideas of the Siege of Orgrimmar with Warlords of Draenor, merge it all together into this whole Garrosh-centered expansion where Garrosh is the final boss of the expansion. He's of his own expansion and doesn't take over Pandaria's final spot. And if we're talking about Garrosh, his imprisonment, his escape that we've never seen in the game, we have to talk about the Warlords of Draenor. And you could really say that Draenor was a huge waste altogether, but not for the same reasons that I think most people playing the game would say. Draenor was a huge waste because it had a lot of great ideas that got wasted because the expansion really got shafted. Like, I didn't hate Warlords of Draenor because it had some great ideas, some great potential that never got realized. Like, I'm sure that many people watching this already know this, but if you don't, in the alpha of Warlords of Draenor, in the early alpha, the expansion was completely different. Like, look at the early alpha maps of Draenor, and they look very different from the one version that we got in the actual expansion. Because like halfway through the alpha, someone on the dev team got really scared of orc fatigue. Like, they had a whole patch in Pandaria that was all about orcs, and now we had a whole expansion about orcs, so they were really scared that we would be tired of fighting orcs. I don't know why we would be tired of fighting orcs, but we're not tired of fighting demons and all the other kind of crap that we constantly fight. But someone was very scared of orc fatigue. So halfway through the alpha, they like completely remodeled the expansion. They shifted a lot of zones, and the expansion as a whole lost a lot of consistency. And because of the fiasco with the garrisons, and because of how everything was mishandled, the expansion got pretty much abandoned halfway through, and then suddenly we have a demon invasion in the final patch. It's not a wasted idea, because then after that demon invasion, we get the whole demon expansion. But Draenor had a lot of potential for a lot of ideas. And remember how they advertised it originally as a new world, not a new continent, like they always advertised a new expansion with a new continent. They advertised a new world. And if you look at the map, the original map from that announcement, you see like fragments of other continents on the map. And they was originally saying that like the Goria, the Ogre Empire, originally came from that other continent there in the corner. And looking at that harbor in Shadowmoon Valley, that makes me think that they were originally planning to like pivot the whole game towards Draenor, that they were planning on pivoting the whole game towards Draenor and giving us expansions in those new continents on Draenor, and really expanding on that lore and like moving away from Azeroth for a little bit. But you know, Draenor got really shafted. Even the one expansion got like cut in half pretty much because of that early shift really cascaded out and broke the whole expansion. So while we don't have very clear ideas that could have been expansions in the world, there definitely was a lot of wasted potential in Warlords of Draenor. After Draenor, we come to the expansion that to many people today is the best expansion yet, the best expansion they ever made, and that is of course Legion. And you might think it's a sacrilege to say like they wasted a lot of potential in Legion, but actually Legion wastes a lot of ideas. waste a lot of ideas that could have stood on its own. Because even at the release of Legion, we have the Emerald Nightmare raid. And at the time, it was planned to just completely close the topic of the Emerald Dream, Emerald Nightmare, because they wanted to just close the topic. And this, the whole idea of the Emerald Dream, it was an expansion idea for Blizzard too, from very early on. Even from vanilla time, they were thinking about making an expansion all about the Emerald Dream, but they ended up scrapping those ideas because they couldn't think of making a whole expansion where everything is just green. But why? Why would you make everything green in the Emerald? I know it's called the Emerald Dream, but that doesn't mean you have to just put a green haze everywhere. According to the lore, the Emerald Dream was supposed to be the blueprint for Azeroth. It was supposed to be an echo of what the world looked, at least one of the layers of it was supposed to be the echo of what the world used to look like before the mortal races changed the world around them, and before events like the Sundering really shattered the world, or really changed the world around them. So you could have made, and so if it's the idea of nature, the original nature, before the encroachment of mortal races, it doesn't have to be just green forests everywhere, because nature is more than just green forests everywhere. Besides, having some nightmare zones in the Emerald Dream expansion, which would give you a different palette of like black and red. You can have sea zones with islands that give you a lot of blues and yellows. You can have a desert zone in the Emerald Dream, because originally in that part of the world of Kalimdor, before the Sundering, there was a desert. Because, face it, deserts are nature too. Deserts are nature too. Like at least half of, if not majority of the deserts in WoW come from some major catastrophe. Like Uldum is a desert because of a catastrophe. Vol'dun is a desert because of a catastrophe. Tanaris is a desert because of a catastrophe. Why are all the deserts coming from catastrophes? Deserts are natural environments that come from natural processes. So there could be a desert zone in the Emerald Dream. There can be swamp zones in the Emerald Dream, because you can have a whole variety of natural environments. Just give them this primordial, untouched spin. And you have a whole expansion of the Emerald Dream with all kinds of different palettes. But because they were so stuck on that green thing, they shoved the Emerald Dream in 2 patches. Kind of part of a patch, of the release patch of Legion, which was the whole Nightmare in Dream plot ended up in Val'Shara and the Emerald Nightmare raid, and it was comparable to a whole patch that we later got in Dragonflight, where we got a zone of Belameth and the Emerald Dream raid. So it was eventually we got like 2 zones, 2 patches out of the Emerald Dream, but instead it could have easily been its own expansion because of all the potential of like this primordial natural environment it could give us. But this is not the last wasted expansion in Legion, because if you remember, the expansion ends with us going to Argus to deal with the Burning Legion once and forever. And Argus, like the capital of the Burning Legion, the whole world gets shafted into like 3 zones, but are they really that big of a zones? Can you really count them as separate zones in World of Warcraft when you get like these 3 relatively small zones that are all part of a single storyline in a single patch out of the whole world that was the capital of the Burning Legion? Like, it is the home world of the Draenei. Argus could have easily held an expansion of its own, if not being the core part of a Twisting Nether expansion. I once had this whole Twisting Nether expansion concept where you would also get ships that you could level separately and make them travel across the Twisting Nether to various different worlds. And the Argus patch really uses a lot of the same ideas, except, for giving you ships. But it uses a lot of the same ideas. So Argus could easily have been either a whole expansion by itself, or just the final leg of the Twisting Nether expansion, instead of everything, all of that potential being shoved in a single final patch of Legion. And then we come to probably one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest wasted potentials in the history of World of Warcraft, and that is Battle for Azeroth. Battle for Azeroth feels like 3 or 4 expansions crammed together, because ostensibly the expansion is about the Fourth War, Alliance versus Horde, and that is a huge idea by itself. But then we also have it on the lying on the base of the kind of a South Seas expansion. You get, as the continents, you get Kultiras and Zandalar, and various small islands of the South Seas as island expeditions. So you could argue that the Fourth War has to take place somewhere, and they weren't going to make an expansion that takes you back to the old world because Cataclysm wasn't popular, and just having an expansion that just makes you travel around the old zones again wouldn't go well, so they had to put it in some new place, and they decided to put it in Kultiras and Zandalar. But really, the South Seas could have stood on their own as a separate thing from the war. The war could have been taking place somewhere else, could have been taking place in the old world if they focused. But I do not blame them too much for the South Seas thing. But because the South Seas expansion ended up being just Kultiras and Zandalar, I feel like we will never get a proper South Seas expansions now. We'll never see Hiji or Plunder Isle. We'll never see Baylor, for example, one of the many other islands out there. Kazan, what did they do with Kazan? Kazan, we got small pieces of Kazan in 3 expansions. We got a small piece of Kazan in Cataclysm. We got a small piece of Kazan in Battle for Azeroth, and now we got another small piece of Kazan in The War Within. The Kazan is getting cut up into tiny pieces, and I don't really know why they do that with Kazan. Kazan, if Kultiras and Zandalar can be their own expansion, then Kazan and Tel Aviv could have been the mirror expansion, where you go to the other side of the sea and you visit Kazan and Tel Aviv, and then you spend a whole expansion with that part of the sea. If they can make an expansion out of Kultiras and Zandalar, they can make a whole expansion out of those. But because the South Seas ended up being the theater of the so-called Fourth War, we might never see a South Seas expansion. But that is not the end. That is just the beginning of the problems with Battle for Azeroth, because there is a second, probably the biggest wasted potential of BFA, and that is Azshara, a villain that is one of the oldest, most major villains of the Warcraft universe. And she really has the potential to hold up a whole expansion on her own. We could have had this whole expansion that is focusing on either the South Seas, either the islands, and fighting the Naga there, make the whole South Seas expansion about the Naga, or an expansion that takes place underwater. I know, players hated playing Vashir, but I'm sure they could have done something more with it. I'm sure they could have done something more with it that would make the Naga underwater expansion more palatable. And really the whole hate for Bashir is really undeserved, because yes, there is a whole section at the start of Bashir that is really frustrating, and I think that one small section at the start is what really turned people off Bashir, and it gives you a really bad impression of it, and it probably shouldn't have happened. But there is that whole small section at the beginning of Bashir when you don't have the water breathing yet, and the Naga are everywhere around you. They are in 3 dimensions all around you. And because your screen has only 2 dimensions, and it's smaller in the vertical direction, you don't see the Naga above you and below you at the same distance as you would see them, like in front of you or to the sides of you. So you were pulling them a lot. You were not seeing a lot of the mobs that were in range to attack you because of the graphical issues. But just remove that part, or just flatten that whole part, and make sure that the Naga don't attack you from above, or give us more tools to deal with the vertical direction like they did in Dragonflight with the dragon riding mounts. I'm sure they could have done a lot more to make a South Seas expansion more palatable, but because of that knee-jerk reaction to that first bit of Bashir, we got robbed of the whole idea of a whole expansion dealing with the Azhara and the Naga. And instead, we get a Ny'alotha that isn't Ny'alotha. I got a whole video about this. And it's not even the full major element of the patch, because there is a whole mechagon. There's half the patch is taking place off this so-called Ny'alotha, and Azhara gets completely shouted into like a 3/4 of a patch. Azhara, one of the oldest, biggest villains in the setting, and I know that she's still alive, that she gets kidnapped at the end, and then you find her in Ny'alotha, and then she breaks free there at the end, and we haven't really seen her since then. I know that she's technically somewhere out there and still alive, so she could return. But if she returns as anything more than a patch or a raid boss, if we somehow get a Naga expansion out of Azhara's return in the future, I will eat my hat. And I do not even have a hat. I will buy a hat and then eat it. Don't quote me on that, please. I'm not actually going to eat a hat, but this is a saying people say. Maybe I'll make a hat out of it. Maybe I make a cake in the shape of a hat, and then eat that cake in the shape of a hat. So Blizzard, if you want to do something funny, make a Naga expansion. So I will have to make a cake in the shape of a hat, and then eat it. Because, Azhara really should have had a whole expansion for herself. But that's still not the end of the problems with Battle for Azeroth, because you got the whole last idea that feels like it doesn't really fit with BFA, and that is the whole Ny'alotha in the Old Gods plotline. And I know the expansion is ostensibly... there are 2 major elements running through the beginning of BFA. That is, the Fourth War, Alliance versus Horde, because the Horde always has to do something stupid and provoke the Alliance again. And then you have the Heart of Azeroth, the wounded planet, bleeding, and this Azerite, and everyone fighting over that Azerite. And initially it's Alliance and Horde fighting over that Azerite, but later the whole Old Gold element returns and pops back in. And it twists the expansion again. Out of that whole... in the Fourth War, in the end, ends up getting shafted again, and we end up standing outside the gates of Orgrimmar again, and deposing another war chief. This is the end of your Fourth War? Really? This is how you wanted the new global world war in Warcraft? This is how you wanted it to go? Like a weaker repeat of the ending of Mists of Pandaria? And then the Old Gods Ny'alotha takes over the expansion, and they do very little with that too, because Ny'alotha, after being this cunning manipulator for years and years, he ends up getting a laser blasted in his face. A lot has been said about the ending of BFA. But really, Ny'alotha and the Old Gods and Ny'alotha and that whole plotline, it really should have been, again, another expansion. So there's like 3 to 4 expansions crammed into BFA. And it feels like they crammed all these ideas together into this one expansion because they wanted to just, get these pesky old lore ideas out of the way, because we need to get to the thing that we just invented. And that is Shadowlands. And Shadowlands is really kind of a reverse of the same problem, because Shadowlands, it feels like something that shouldn't have been an expansion. And I'm not just saying, it was a bad expansion, just delete it. No, it is much deeper than that, because Shadowlands, as an idea, it is the plane of death. It is the afterlife. At least in the canon lore, it is the ultimate afterlife. And if we spend a whole expansion in the afterlife, it starts looking a lot less like afterlife and more like just life. Like, look at like Bastion or Revendreth. A lot of it looks like it could just be like a zone somewhere on Azeroth, or like a planet somewhere in the living universe. A lot of that looks like that. Or we got Maldraxxus that is just just Scourge, which completely broke a lot of the old lore regarding the Scourge and where their inspiration came from. It turns out they didn't get the ideas for Ziggurats from the Nerubians. Turns out they got it from the Shadowlands. Shadowlands does that a lot, where it reframes a lot of the old lore in the sense of, no, actually, it came from this. It came from the place we just invented. All of Shadowlands feels like, no. These guys that used to be making the game, they used to be making the lore, they don't know shit. We're gonna make this better. I got my own Titans, but even more Titan. I got my own Scourge, but it's even Scourgier. A lot of Shadowlands feels like that, and I'm not opposed completely to the idea of using Shadowlands at all. And it shouldn't have been a setting for an expansion. Shadowlands should have been maybe a zone or two, like Argus ended up being used, or like the Emerald Nightmare ended up being used. Just like a zone or a raid, or a couple of zones that take place during an expansion that is otherwise taking place somewhere in the physical mortal universe. That's how Shadowlands should have actually been used. You will notice that I don't have these cosmic realms as the ideas for expansions in my list here, because these cosmic realms are best used in moderation. If you use them too much, if you see them too much, if you spend too much time in them, they stop feeling cosmic and they start feeling too lived in, too normal. So Shadowlands ends up being kind of the reverse of the same problem. Now, in Dragonflight, there aren't really any more of those crammed expansions in there. The patches for Dragonflight to really take place on Dragon Isles or under Dragon Isles or around Dragon Isles. All the patches are focused on their main themes. They're really all about dragons. The whole expansion is really all about dragons. And sure, there is a small problem with Dragonflight in that it kind of just ends. It doesn't have a finale. It just kind of stops. Think about it. In Dragonflight, well, you got on the Dragon Isles. You see the one dragon trying to free the other evil dragons. The other evil dragons get freed. They break out. and then you like look underground for one of them. That one dragon breaks out, and then you make friends with another of the evil dragons who turns out to be not so evil. And you in the final patch in the Emerald Dream, you fight one of those evil dragons, and then it just ends. The big boss, their leader, he's like fought as like a dungeon boss briefly, but it's like an alternate timeline that gets cancelled. So it kind of ends, and that is a problem. But it doesn't really cram the expansions, another expansion, into it, like many of the others do. And now, of course, in the War Within, we have Karesh just crammed into the War Within. Like the whole expansion of the War Within so far has been about like the World Soul, Kazalgar, and the underground zones under Kazalgar. So it kind of is like the Dark Below expansion idea a little bit. Though I still think like the Ajka head is kind of like an off-brand Azul Nerub, and I kind of wish we did get the real Azul Nerub, but it's okay. I don't mind Ajka head. It's okay, it's fine. The whole expansion was about that. And now in the final patch, in the final part of the expansion, we go into space. We suddenly in Karesh, yeah, like I said in the beginning, could have easily held up a whole expansion, but instead it gets crammed into a single patch. And that is why I fear that when we finally see the Arathi home continent, that it's going to be a single patch in like Midnight or The Last Titan. I fear that it's going to be just, instead of being a whole expansion, which it really could be, like the Arathi continent doesn't have a lot of lore, but it has some very unique lore that could easily hold up an expansion. The Arathi could easily hold up a whole expansion to them, but I fear that they will get crammed into Midnight as a patch, or into Last Titan as a patch, and that's all we'll see of them. Now, I know this is just doomsaying at this point, but if you look at all the evidence in the past behind us, I have reasons to feel that that's what's going to happen. There's another idea that kind of like underlines many expansions, weaves through the many expansions, and it was kind of speculated to be a whole expansion at some point, and it was like some kind of time travel expansion. And we get like tiny pieces of it. We had ideas of like a War of the Ancients expansion, where we would go to the old Kalimdor, travel back to the past, to those events that were already time traveled to. And I don't mean like Warlords of Draenor. The Warlords of Draenor is not a time travel expansion. Okay, there is time travel taking place in Warlords of Draenor, and we are seeing a past version of the existing zones. But it's not really about the time travel. The time travel is just how we get there. There was this whole idea about the time travel expansion that really could have been something on its own, but I guess people were afraid it was too confusing, so it ended up not really materializing as an expansion. Can it still happen? Maybe. I'm not positive that it will happen, like after Last Titan, but who knows? In the end, Blizzard really likes just rushing through the ideas, rushing through these huge concepts that could each hold up an expansion on its own that really should have been their own expansions, and ends up not really doing so much with them, and we end up seeing just tiny pieces of what could have been a whole world on its own. But maybe that is just me being an old Warcraft grognard, pining for things we will now never see in the game in any form, because the MMO took over everything for this setting, and because the MMO itself does very little with what it actually takes. So maybe I am just a doomsayer after all these expansions. But I think I have good reasons to be. And I hope to see you next time on something that is a little more positive. And I hope that you at least enjoyed looking back with me at all those could have beens that we never got in the end. So I hope to see you next time.